Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Thank you for joining us for today's event, Pedagogy of the Small, Models, Miniatures, Devices. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, and we respect the continued connections with the past, the present, and the future, and our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Here at Fourth Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge. We co-create daily activities, examining research questions and projects in development across the university. We're running today's event as a live stream Zoom meeting, as well as live stream to YouTube. So those of you joining us there, if you have any comments or questions, just pop those into the chat. Those of you here in the space later on, if there's a little bit of time for some Q&A, raise your hand, we'll bring a microphone around to you so that everyone can hear. That's enough for me. It's very much my pleasure to pass the microphone over to the professor in theater and director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Society and Culture, Mark Sussman. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Doug. Thanks for passing it to me. This is a event organized by the two of us, myself and my colleague in communication studies here at Concordia, Antonia Hernández. We're going to introduce the panel, the speakers for today, speakers and performers for today, and I want to thank you all for coming this afternoon. I want to also thank, as always, the team at Fourth Space. It always feels a little bit like you're in like a 747 that's about to take off when the events start here. Isa, Jax, Doug, and Bertie. It's always a great pleasure. And also want to thank Center for Interdisciplinary Studies for supporting today's event and the presenters and participants who you're going to hear from. So this really came out of some conversations between Antonia and myself about the idea of miniatures, and we wanted to weave together a few different ideas, one of which is pedagogy and one of which is miniatures or small things, hence the title, Pedagogy of the Small, Models, Miniatures, and Devices. And different ones of us who are going to present today use different terms and think about models in slightly different ways. And really, this is a kind of an experiment or a space for us together to think about the resonances between our different ways of thinking of and conceiving of models. Does that seem like a good place to start?
I totally agree.
Do you want to add a word?
Well, that's to say thank you to everyone being with us today and the people on Zoom, because this is actually an experiment, and we really want to know where it goes. So we are very happy to share this with you, and thank you for the trust.
And as Antonia said in some of our emails back and forth, it's really a pleasure to work with iterations, to work with trying something again, trying something again. So this is like a first step in hopefully what will be a series of more experiments, some of which will have models and performers doing things, and some will have people talking and thinking out loud. So, so our presenters today are myself and Antonia, Jonathan Berger, artist who will join us via Zoom from New York City, Pablo Gershanik, and performer Caitlin Ross. So that's the lineup this afternoon.
Let's clap.
All right. Yay, good. So welcome. Should I kick it off?
Go ahead.
Okay,
Go ahead.
I'm going to kick it off. So I'm actually going to read a little text that has been making the rounds, I guess, to a few different disciplinary conferences over the last couple of years, and each time it gets shorter. So it's also a bit of a miniature. It's been squeezed and compressed. So hopefully this will be the shortest version that you hear, but it's maybe about 15 minutes. And it has some images that you should be able to see in a minute. So I'll get going. So this is called Toy Theater Pedagogy. And I have to just start by doing a big, deep thanks to the members of my theater company, Great Small Works, with whom these ideas have been developed over a real long period of time. And the paper illustrates some of that, but I can't say it too often, that we've really synthesized some of these ideas collectively as a group. So shout out to Great Small Works. And hopefully some of the themes in here will resonate with the other presenters today. Okay, so this is about the model theater, which is a category that includes and also broadens a 19th century form of theater called toy theater or paper theater. Some of you here will know it well, others you'll be experiencing it for the first time. It's also called the juvenile drama, and it's a miniature tabletop, usually a proscenium-based form of puppet theater that demands a task-based, focused intentionality that is delightful and absorbing to watch and relatively easy to accomplish for novice performers of any age. Workshops in toy theater performance creation, developed over many years by the Brooklyn-based collective Great Small Works, offer an embodied pedagogy grounded in handmade design and construction, improvised dramaturgy, puppet manipulation, narration, and musical accompaniment. As part of a collaborative team, workshop participants accomplish something on a grand conceptual scale, beginning with a supply of recycled images, simple art supplies, found texts, themes, and stories, and usually a corrugated cardboard box. Now, are people seeing the images in a big? Yes, there we go, yay. Okay, drawing on the company's history of creating and devising toy theater shows and teaching the form to students from elementary to postgraduate level, incarcerated youth, teachers in training, cultural animators, professional puppeteers, and the general public, this paper reflects on the elements and implications of model theater pedagogy. How might a minor form that depends on miniature scale and ecologically light impact play a transformative role for participants engaging in a compressed process, lasting from an afternoon to a week or two in duration? And what secret signals may be sent forth when adults play with toys? Quote, "The theater is the art form of the child because it is ephemeral," Walter Benjamin writes in a 1928 essay on proletarian children's theater. He considers the value of Soviet-era revolutionary children's theater, and he critiques the bourgeois form of education emerging as part of Germany's youth culture movement. Quote, "The performance is the great creative pause in the process of upbringing. It represents in the realm of children what the carnival was in the old cults. Everything was turned upside down, and just as in Rome, the master served the slaves during Saturnalia, in the same way in a performance, children stand on the stage and instruct and teach the attentive educators. What is truly revolutionary is the, quote, secret signal of what is to come that speaks from the gesture of the child." So that's Benjamin writing in 1928. Why is this revolutionary? Benjamin calls theatrical performances made by and for children the radical unleashing of play. Children here are conceived as always potential revolutionary subjects, not yet fully formed by bourgeois civilization, in love with movement, action, and mimetic play, which again raises for us the question of what might be at stake when adults build models, play with toy theaters, and animate miniature landscapes. Let's see if I'm in the right place. No, I think I'm one ahead. Anyway, that's what we should be looking at. Okay, the more capacious term model theater as opposed to toy theater, signals a relation of the miniature or toy proscenium stage to life-size theater architecture and scenography, analogous to the relation between a child's model airplane or train set or dollhouse and the real thing. Roland Barthes lamented that toys were merely, quote, a microcosm of the adult world, reduced copies of human subjects, requiring that the child can only identify himself, he writes, as owner, as user, never as creator. He does not invent the world, he uses it, unquote. That's Barthes. I would argue that the empty cardboard box awaiting scenographic decor, characters, backdrops, and action encourages a different set of relations, whereby the performer playing with puppets, miniatures, or toys might model invention and transformation of the world, whether as a child or an adult. So traditional toy or paper theaters were miniature versions of the neoclassical proscenium stage, rendered in printed paper sheets, bound in a book, complete with characters, scenery, and a play text, available in color or black and white, and ready to be cut and mounted on cardboard for performance in the Victorian home. Popular in the middle decades of the 19th century, this form of parlor entertainment implied both a commodified system of circulation of toys and printed materials aimed at a newly created market for a newly created subject, the child. The European versions of the form, théâtre de papier, théâtre de papel, papierenthéâtre, originally presumed a living room, a bourgeois family setting, disposable income, and the time to play and perform the hits of the West End melodrama, romance, pantomime, and farce, as rendered scene by artists hired by publishers. Although mostly associated with its heyday in England, Spain, France, and Northern Europe in the mid-19th century, flat image-based performance genres are found in Mexico, Japan, India, China, anywhere you have flat 2D paintings, artist books, or graphic arts traditions that are animated in performance. You can think of toy theater as a method of performing the book or the cartoon, connected to the many pre-cinematic methods of staging moving images, from scroll-based storytelling in Southeast Asia, Persia, and China, to the more modern kamishibai tradition in Japan, and of course, to shadow theater traditions worldwide. So forward to the 20th century. Members of Great Small Works, co-creators, puppeteers Jenny Romaine, John Bell, Trudy Cohen, and Stephen Kaplan took up the form, to present a surreal news serial on cabaret stages in the pre-internet 1990s, when the New York Times and tabloid newspapers were the daily common text, and the inevitability of the Bush administration's first war in the Persian Gulf was the dominant narrative of US mainstream media, literally piling up in the city's newly mandated recycling bins. So this theater, the Toy Theater of Terror as Usual, an ongoing serial, partly inspired by an essay by cultural anthropologist Michael Taussig, was conceived to throw a wrench in the works of how everyday stories of terror circulate and accumulate power through their very repetition. Model stages were easily moved on and off stage, requiring little technology except portable clip lights, a homemade dimmer box, and a couple of folding tables. You didn't need a theater because you brought it with you. Counter-narratives, inspired by the tradition of Weimar photomontage artist John Hartfield, could be staged with the help of the neighborhood photocopy shop for enlarging or multiplying images, mat board, glue, and scores of X-Acto blades. Through the construction of each scene as live composition of a tableau and surprising juxtaposition of narrative elements, the toy theater can reimagine the political imaginary. The 13th episode of Terror as Usual, titled Whistles and Leaks, incorporates scenes featuring writing by the US military whistleblower Chelsea Manning, the Iron Mountain Data Storage Company, Helicopters and Butterflies, a Kurt Weill Broadway musical tune about the Rockefeller family and Manhattan real estate development, and the Aeschylus play Prometheus Bound. So those are all sources in this one little 20-minute show. The final scene incorporates rear projection of a widely circulated US military video from the sky above Baghdad, made public by Chelsea Manning via WikiLeaks. The incorporation of 3D objects, video, and other hybrid elements led us to think of, quote, reinvention rather than preservation of the form, in the words of puppeteer Trudy Cohen. So while creating and touring shows using this format, the company produced an increasingly complex series of festivals gathering the international community of toy theater artists. Toy theater festivals always included exhibitions by artists working with the form, and intergenerational workshops evolved. They began with small groups sitting and contemplating empty cardboard boxes, shortly to be transformed into theaters with side wings and overhead fly space, accompanied by a stack of newspapers, magazines, and other sources of images from recycling bins. Groups were encouraged to think of grandiose themes, everyday problems, or images that catch the eye. And we asked them to name themselves as little temporary theater companies. Thematic questions may be built into the workshop, or they may simply emerge as groups on a tight time budget negotiate over what topics to address. This is the model theater's secret weapon: quick engagement with the art of montage. When does the scene cut? What comes in between what to cover scene changes? How will sound be produced when everyone's hands are busy? Group members share dramaturgical authority, flattening the hierarchy among students and teachers, kids and adults, friends and strangers. The final performing takes the uninitiated by surprise. This type of puppetry avoids the requirement of expert performing background thanks to the generous intervention of the cutout characters and scenery, which stand between performers and audience, channeling their voice and energy. It privileges direct storytelling and simple acts of manipulation. It's demonstrative and pedagogical, a theater of compositional process and handmade montage that speaks back to the dominant media in which we are increasingly immersed, with what Rancière has called a, quote, an emancipatory method, unquote. That method starts from the assumption that everyone in the room is an artist and indeed already an expert. By de-individualizing authority and collapsing categories so often kept separate, dramaturgy, design, construction, performing, the workshop offers nothing if not an accessible experience. The miniature theater becomes an element in the pedagogical triangle. In other words, just as puppet theater channels expressive energies from the performer through the inanimate object towards the audience, the teaching is displaced via the absorbed focus in the proscenium box as groups perform at each workshop's conclusion. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about one example of a workshop and wrap it up. Patriarchy is a house. And what four pillars hold up this house? They are called capitalism, racism, colonialism, and gender. Sustaining these pillars, the ground upon which they stand, are the bodies of women. On the eve of our workshop with the group formerly called, their name has changed, what at the time was called the Asamblea de Feminismo Comunitario in the high barrio of Villa Fatima in La Paz, Bolivia, Adriana Guzman, activist and educator with this group, draws this diagram to orient the three newly arrived workshop teachers from the US and Canada, grad student in folklore, musician, and Toronto puppeteer Max Kelly, performance artist and teacher Doris DiFarnesio, then based in Chiapas, and this Great Small Works member and theater professor from Brooklyn and Montreal. The common starting point is that feminism demands intersectional practice and disobedience to the existing social order and the transformation of the Bolivian state to live a non-patriarchal reality in private and public space. This is what we're being educated into as we arrive to launch this workshop. So the next day after this teaching, groups of children and adults join us to begin a workshop in Teatro de Papel. An 8-year-old girl steps up to introduce the group's communitarian philosophy, drawing the diagram you've just seen for the other kids in an astonishing performance of student teaching the teachers, still dizzy from the change in altitude in this 12,000-foot high city ringed by jagged mountains where the rich folks, we're told, live near the government buildings in the flat urban center of the valley floor. It's the week following the mass media spectacle of teenagers standing on stages across the United States, most notably before the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., at March for Our Lives manifestations. And I can't help connecting these moments in considering what children have to teach adults, the role of theater training, and the force of direct representations of experience, particularly of moments of terror. And yet, can we even say children? Back then, something felt like it had shifted. These teenage survivors of the mass shooting at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, like so many others since, were instantly transformed into activists with social media handles, wise in the ways of intersectional alliance and category-defying formations of identity. They were theater kids, we were told, also school newspaper and debate club kids formed by what used to be called, quote, extracurricular activities, now very much the central curriculum of their lives as witnesses, gun control activists, and first responders in a dizzily distracted media environment. Quote, a great creative pause in the process of upbringing, to use Benjamin's phrase, for children's theater, is one way to think of Emma Gonzalez, who you see here, commanding 6 minutes and 20 seconds of silence on the National Mall, equally astonishing compared with an 8-year-old's lecture on the patriarchal infrastructure of the modern state. Her job, back to Bolivia, her job on day one is to give her fellow participants a crash course in the values and practices of our host group, to inform their creations using this cheap and portable form that will start with a pile of cardboard boxes and recycled newspapers, and end a week later with 4 new tabletop proscenium shows centering the imagined future lives of women in Bolivian society, performed in a local school, at a university, and on the group's YouTube channel. Our host collective grew out of an earlier group called Mujeres Creando, organized in 1992 out of an impulse to critique the institutionalized and patriarchal Bolivian left, without allegiance to political party or NGOs, but with strong anarchist, feminist, Aymara and Quechua affinities, and with membership across classes and social groups, urban and rural, gay and straight. The Asamblea was started in 2002, quote, as a space to render our utopias a reality in the here and now, unquote, and importantly, in the context of the greater process of top to bottom socioeconomic change undertaken by the first indigenous president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, launched with the adoption of a new constitution in 2008 and ending with a disputed election that some called a coup in 2019. The group's structure as a communal enterprise consisting of social actions, educational work, media production, training, and everyday living was part of the construction of a newly imagined Bolivian society. While typical theater forms, we were told, were not of much interest to the group, the handmade and intergenerational nature of a toy theater workshop seemed attractive, at least attractive enough to invite us to join them. Communitarian feminism involves nothing short of the unmaking of patriarchy and colonization. What kind of making and remaking might this marginal form of miniature handmade theater have to offer? An easily accessible form that affords tiny aesthetic and discursive spaces where artists make the rules and tell their stories. It slowly became clear as we listened to our young workshop leader build her house and name its pillars and foundations, why a group dedicated to putting political theory into social action might be attracted to a fundamentally amateur form of puppetry, originally aimed at children, even as the women told us the art of theater had never much interested them. Graffiti and street art, sure, but theater, that's something for people with time on their hands. Performers working with objects and puppets regularly appear across a range of public spaces, from political demonstrations to museums, festival cabarets to the Olympics opening ceremonies, carnivalesque urban interventions to rural pageantry. Despite this increasing visibility, the question of whether puppetry is inherently an art form for children persists in the popular narrative, as we've all seen. The eternally recurring discovery of serious puppetry proclaims that performances using puppets are amazingly not just for children. Why this discovery recurs is a much broader question that might engage with capitalism's incessant normalization of puppetry as a child's form, not to mention the reinforcement of a bourgeois separation of the world of the child from that of the adult, a separation that Benjamin pondered in his essays on children's toys and play. Children, he writes, quote, form their world of things by themselves, a small world in the large one, full of the most incomparable objects that capture the attention, unquote, especially, quote, garbage and junk left over from building, gardening, housework, sewing, or carpentry. Model theater combines this juvenile tendency towards improvisatory bricolage with the realm of stories that range from the mythic to the banal, the ridiculous to the documentary, and given its powerful ability to show big ideas within the limits of the tiny frame or the tabletop landscape. Quote, surrounded by a world of giants, Benjamin writes, children use play to create a world appropriate to their size. But the adult who finds himself threatened by the real world and can find no escape removes its sting by playing with its image in reduced form, unquote. The ability to invert the loss of control we experience in contemporary life may be part of what's at stake in this rediscovery of model theater, neatly suited to demonstrating the burdens of history and the careful making and brutal unmaking of the world. Given the acceptance, even celebration, of the aesthetic seriousness of the puppetry arts, it seems worthwhile to reconsider the trope of the child's privileged affinity for playing with toys, wherein the model affords a child's palpable sense of agency and demonstrates some degree of power, even if temporary or imagined. There you go, thank you. Oops, last image. Thanks. And now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Antonia Hernández, Department of Communication Studies, and I'll let you take it from there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mark.
Yay.
Okay, so I do have, yes, my slides, okay. So thank you for being here, and I'm going to take a slightly more abstract path on the pedagogy of the small, and I'm going to talk about what I call the research device. It comes from my practice, and for my practice with miniatures, which is not what I always do, but that's not exactly the point. But while this research device is small, like many other small things, it has big ambitions of universality and aspires to be useful in the developing of artistic projects. So as my students already know, I have been trying to evangelize everyone with this research device, so thank you for signing up. So not stopping just there, this research device expects to be a tool for feminist and queer creative practice, and many of the other things that you can see there. So, well, in my opinion, it's very useful, so I'm gonna try to convince you. While this research device aspires to do many things, there are other things that it does not. The research device is an heuristic device that doesn't explain anything. It is a model, but cannot be scaled. It's perhaps a metaphor that wants to be taken literally. So the research device borrows the structure of other things and translates them for its own sake. It uses figures, images, or other people's disciplines to give projects a flexible yet reliable exoskeleton. So I will use my work as an example before proposing a series of principles for enacting it. And I have been trying to extricate the research device from my work, but I haven't been able just yet, so please indulge me. So for my doctoral degree, I was studying the domestic aspect of a campsite where people broadcast sexual performances from their rooms, or spaces call it in that way. I had many questions and want to develop an artistic project around it, but I didn't have clarity at that time. So the grid of thumbnails with different performers on the homepage of the site remind me of a building complex where everyone had the lights on all the time. So I started working with that idea of this website as a building complex. But to make it more manageable, I conceived it as a dollhouse with a series of rooms. I create a model to work with the screen recordings in the forms of a dollhouse, and that's how the dollhouse started taking over the research. It did so conceptually. What I was studying was so complex that I had no option but to reduce it. So I dollhoused the problem, choosing to concentrate on some aspects over others. So things were doing well. I was showing the artwork around, receiving good feedback. It looks very sexy, but I had the nagging feeling that something was not correct. While the performer had no expectation of privacy on that particular site, they could safely assume that we're not going to become part of an artwork. Reluctantly, I decided to not work with other bodies' images. But the dollhouse remained. Like in a terrible misunderstanding, I realized that while I was not going to perform a sexual show, I could still perform, and that my room could also serve as one. So with the help of a friend, I think now, yeah, this is the video. Okay. So with the help of a friend, I developed a portable room big enough for my hands. And can we run the video? And I start broadcasting back to the same campsite. Sorry. No sound, please. Okay. So the room then became the space and for the research, where I could investigate interaction with audiences in real time and communicate my ideas about the project. But the dollhouse had its own principle. At first, I thought that I was going to perform maintenance act in a sort of tribute to performer artist Mier Lukele. But then I understood that once there, I could not play. This was not only about the work of play, but also about the play of work. And as with any game worthy of respect, I had to surrender myself to that experience. So for me, the apparition of the dollhouse in my research was extremely useful. It was so useful that I cannot stop talking about this. So that's what I want to tell you about and promote the incorporation of the research device. So I'm going to, it is not only, I don't think it's only for like miniature things, but it's more like a model for a model or a model of a model. So I want to end by outlining the preliminary principles. So, can we come? Yeah, okay, so yeah, that's the space. So these are like the 6 preliminary principles, and I'm very open to receive suggestions about this. So first, the research device is a figuration. So the research device activates concept, and this is like comes obviously from a feminist lineage of thinking concept as figuration. So this device, like its purpose is to activate concept and understand the potential for action that the concept have. So it borrows power from pre-existing figures, images, other people's practices, and translate them into convenient, flexible structure. For example, in other projects, I have used pilgrimage as a structure for a project, also with many parts, and opera for another. Sometimes the structure is implicit, sometimes it is an exoskeleton. So the research device has constraints. It has to have constraints. So these constraints limit the research in scope, time, or space. So that's like help like having a structure. So more than restrictions, constraints should be understood as game rules, not external to the game, but part of it. As in a game, the rules have to be clear but not rigid, and adaptable but not completely loose. As in the Deleuze and Guattari body without organs, this structure is precisely what allows circulation. So the research device is a playground, and a playground for process. The establishment of constraints generates a terrain. Inside, it is possible to experiment, test idea, practice curiosity. And the research device is a playground for the exercise of wonder. And we know that wonder takes over when knowledge and understanding cannot master what they say they would. The research device allows iteration, so the structure can mutate. So rather than cheating, you just create new rules. And the research device is a space for transformation. So while the research device can be very convenient, it's completely useless if you are trying to find what you already know. So yes, looking forward to answering questions and sorry. This is a quote from Andrea Ballestero, who Mark and I tried to invite today, but we weren't successful. So, and well, I really admire her work on devices, and this is a quote that I would like to incorporate as, yes, like a structured space for improvisations. And I really like when she said, like, I want to suggest that devices are not only good thing, good thing to think with, but also good thought to act with. And finally, yes, many thanks to all the students who have engaged with this, and many thanks to those who haven't. And yes, in solidarity, thank you.
Thank you, Antonia. Yes, should we say a word where you mentioned Andrea Ballestero? We're hoping we'll be able to bring her to Concordia perhaps next term. I know some people are familiar with her work. We tried, but we'll keep trying. So our next presenter, I have my introduction notes here, is Jonathan Berger. Welcome. Hi, Jonathan. We see you. Do you hear us okay?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you great. Welcome to Fourth Space in Montreal at Concordia. I'll just introduce you briefly. Jonathan Berger's work has encompassed a spectrum of activity, including sculpture, installation, performance, creative research, archival and curatorial work, education, design, and large-scale collaborative projects. All of his work involves the making of exhibitions, including objects, materials that he collects, seeks out, and recontextualizes, as well as materials that are the product of conversations, exchanges, and oral histories. From 2023 to 25, Jonathan was the subject of a MoMA studio residency, which concluded with an exhibition and a series of live events. He is a clinical associate professor of studio art in the Department of Art and Art Professions at New York University, and he lives and works between New York City and the mighty town of Glover, Vermont. So welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you so much.
Do you want to kick off with speaking about your interest in models and as it's evolved through your work? Would that be a good way to?
Yes, I have a PowerPoint, so
Hooray.
I'm going to. I'm like cursed with technology, so hopefully this is gonna work. Let's see, view. Can some amazing person, let's see, I can do this, I know I can do this. Slideshow. Hold on 1 second here. I actually need a little help. Slideshow. Oh my God. Play from start. Continue share. Can you see this?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Oh my God. Through the miracle of I don't know what. Okay, I'm gonna do my best here and try to rein it in. I'm gonna start my little timer that I don't go over time. Okay, I wanted to start with sort of two very long time reference points for me, like sort of points of inspiration that have to do with the miniature and the monumental, just because they're of personal meaning to me, and we can come back to them, but I just wanted to start with that. So the artist James Lee Byers, who some of you may know, I found out about in college, and he's endlessly fascinating. He was working from the 1950s through the mid 1990s, late 1990s, and he passed away. And he did many things, but he's someone who worked with scale, both scale and fabrication. And I would say they were sort of, inextricably, is that the right word, linked? In brief, like he was sort of interested, I think, in using the miniature and the monumental to kind of create these impossible objects in a way that really like opened a window, because they were sort of inconceivable in a certain sense, into like a sort of a version of the world that was an extension of kind of his philosophies and stuff that was in sort of largely invisible, but the objects kind of like manifested in a certain way this kind of version of reality that he was mapping out and kind of, living in himself. And this is a tiny, tiny glass ball. You can see it to scale with the penny. And he developed all these like largely very secretive, although I did a few projects about his work and got to know people who knew him very well. So I sort of like heard little tidbits about how he made things. But he had a number of different specialty printers who would print, almost microscopic text for him on objects and little pieces of paper and stuff. A lot of the things that he did involved some form of self-portraiture. Let's see. So by contrast, this actually was a gift to a colleague of mine. He lived in her and her husband's hallway on the Upper West Side for a number of years, and this was one of the gifts that he gave them. And then this is a piece called The Golden Tower that was conceived of in the mid-70s, and then was shown a few times. This is me in front of it, being a James Lee Byers superfan nerd. And this was in Milan in, I think, 2023. But that's just, again, this is a gilded, I can't remember what the core is, but it's gilded with gold. And you can see, I think it's 20 meters or something. And then another person who I have a personal, James Lee Byers, I didn't know, but someone that I've worked with for the last 25 years is the artist Vaginal Davis, who some of you may know, who's from Los Angeles, who's sort of a originator of the queer core scene, along with Bruce LaBruce from your fabulous country. Vaginal or Miss Davis, also there's a sort of touring non-retrospective retrospective that's at PS1 at the moment that originated in Stockholm. But the thing that when I first met Vaj in 2000 and visited her at her then LA Koreatown apartment, many people know her or think of her as like a drag queen, which I would say is inaccurate, or performance person or something. But one of the things that she was doing when I met her that she'd been doing for a very long time before I met her was making paintings, and tiny, tiny paintings in her house. This is actually an image of, she relocated to Berlin in 2005. This is an image of her first apartment in Berlin, which she at that time was essentially living in her archive, which you can see. And making these paintings in her home. These are just some other images. You see there's like a sort of a little desk there in front of you and to the right. And she would make these kind of incredible small scale paintings using found paper and makeup. All the paintings are made with often discontinued makeup from old compacts, nail polish, eyeshadow, blush. They're often fixed with hairspray, much like you would fix a charcoal drawing with fixative. Most of them represent her depictions of self-identified female kind of historical figures that she's an, basically like a film historian and, is a really rigorous reader. So she's always looking at these sort of like, feminist histories and kind of portraying them through the paintings, largely through portraiture. But this, to give you a sense, I don't have it to scale, but is like, I would say 2.5 inches by, 1.5 inches. Some of them are actually painted on the backs of matchboxes. These are just some other examples of that where you can sort of see the nail polish and stuff. But, the thing I wanted to bring up about her, which I've been thinking about recently more, is just the fact that these paintings were made in her home, so they're all made in this way where it's like they're being conceived of and created on a very small desk top, And I think there's like an intimacy in that, both through making them, but also when you're in front of them, they're these phenomenally intricate paintings that are so small. But when you see them on a wall with a lot of space around them, they sort of like reproduce in this kind of incredible way. And I've watched her make paintings, many times in her house. She's sort of like, I mean, she calls herself she calls me her child, and she calls herself my mother. She has a number of children. But I think there's something very specific about the way that she makes paintings where they command a tremendous amount of space, and they also command a kind of intimacy that I think is really unique to them and also unusual for painting. I mean, the only other person I could cite historically that I think, maybe is like working at that scale would be like Gertrude Abercrombie, who's like is also making these miniature paintings, surrealist painter in Chicago. Um, anyhow, so how am I doing? 7 minutes. Okay. Already failing. So I, I in 2000, let me just do this. My mother was born in Kaunas, Lithuania in 1941. The Nazi occupation happened through a collaboration with Lithuanian nationalists. My grandmother, her biological father, my mother's biological father was killed right away. She and my grandmother went into the Kovna ghetto, and soon thereafter, my grandmother, as part of a network of people who were working together, smuggled my mother out in a bag into hiding with a Christian family with whom my mother lived for the first 4 years of her life. This is the short version. My grandmother survived, got my mother, and eventually they came to America. And I'd never made any kind of artwork or a project about my family. My mother hadn't been back, since 1945. And in 2017 wanted to go. So we all went. This is actually the house she was hidden in on the left, and then interior of that house on the right. And we went to all these different places, and the sort of that we, kind of found through a guide, who I went on to work with on this project later. We found all these places and went to them and stuff. And it wasn't until like 2021 that I started thinking about like making something and about it. I think a lot of the reason that I'd maybe not gone there or resisted it was sort of like I couldn't quite think of the way to make it felt really high stakes to make something about my family. Like in one way, everything I make is like personal and political. In another way, I'd never made anything overtly personal and political. And I think, the other part of that was I couldn't really figure out a way to make something about like World War II and the Holocaust and my family history in a way that really like fundamentally resisted a Zionist appropriation of that. And yeah, and so it was, sort of like what would a, anti-Zionist project of that nature look like? I didn't really know, I was like, I can't do this. And then I think because it felt so impossible, I don't think it's impossible like in general, but for me to make something that I believed had the potential to be good, or worthwhile, I couldn't figure out a way to do it. And then, it was almost like because it was like so hard, I sort of doubled down on wanting to try. And I started going to Lithuania with like research money from my school and not knowing what I was going to do. And one of the things that I wanted to do to start was to find these other locations in the story that we hadn't found. And I wanted to find the apartment that my family lived in, and my mother and grandmother were taken out of. And I had some information, but very quickly, people in Kaunas, which is a small city, were like, there's this one woman who knows everything. Find her. She can find the apartment. Her name is Maria Onisik. I found her. She, very quickly was able to find the apartment. Um, we went to the apartment, and it turned out that 2 days before we found the address, it had come up for rent randomly. And, I was like, what am I going to do? Not rent it, It was sort of like, that's fucking weird. And so this is the building on the left and the interior on the right. I still hold the lease on it. And I just, I was kind of like, I'm just the sort of person where it's like I never go into trying to make something with a deadline or idea of what I'm going to do. Or I have, things that I've been working on now, one thing since 2010 that never came to be. So I just, I just go into stuff and follow it and try to figure out what the way forward is. But Maria, I didn't know had since 2017 been working on this project, which is the reason she was able to help me, which is that she was trying to make a map of the city of Kaunas from right before the war that accounted World War II, that accounted for all of the buildings in the city, because that map didn't exist. And so she's unemployed. She had taken on this project. She's not trained as a map maker. She's not even formally trained as an architecture historian. She decided to start going to the city archive every day and was paid one A4 sheet of paper at a time, making this map, doing all this research, building by building, figuring out all this sort of quotidian, like daily life notation from the archive, and then entering these sort of plots of land with the specs of the buildings on them into this map. And the thing that was interesting to me about it was I was like, oh, buildings are people. Like if you have a map, of a city and you don't have any sort of notation about, or clarity about like where the buildings are, what they are, you're missing like life. So I got really interested in her project, and I had an opportunity to do this residency, as Mark said. And, I ended up deciding that what I wanted to do, this is just to give you an image of the way the room looked, but what I wanted to do was I asked her if I could use her maps as a sort of a master to build, from which to build this scale model of the city. The other thing I wanted to say about her in relation to Vag actually is she makes all these maps, at her kitchen table in her house, one at a time. And she puts together, a few pages at a time so that they're able to line up. But she had never, and presumably would never see, what now is like, a lot of pieces of paper, that, I mean, I don't know how big it would be, but it would definitely be like, more than 80, if not 100 something feet or something, like this sprawling thing, which again, it's like the miniature and the monumental. There hadn't really been a moment where it had been like all these things starting to be pieced together. And so I think it was like for that reason, and then also because and I'll explain more about this, but sort of had gotten really interested in like manifesting her project through making something that drew on it. I asked her if she would allow me to do this thing, and she agreed. And she actually made a special set. This is like a tenth of this, approximately a tenth of the city. You see her maps on the wall. This is sort of details of the way they look. They're all pretty much on found pieces of paper. I can say more about them later, but this is, let's see if I can do this. Yes. So, this is like the way that I went at the residency was I was sort of like, okay, we have this time to work in the space. I want to build the model on site. I got really interested in using this material mica, which is like a mineral, which you maybe know from like elementary school or something, to construct it because mica, kind of basically can behave like paper, like a rigid paper, which is, I mean, it's a nice thing I realized to say in relation to toy theater or something, but, and I knew that it had these sort of material properties where it was like, it's kind of like two-way mirror or something. It's like you can see through it, but then it becomes reflective and you can do all this stuff with light and you can basically make a model the way you would make a model. It's just like, you know, um, using, a kind of odd material. So me and a number of students of mine all worked together on it. Let's see. Yeah. And sort of like use the map, and then I made all these very specific aesthetic decisions. We used it basically as a template, transformed it into a series of cut sheets at a certain scale. I decided based on the way that she went about notation that every building would be correct volume to scale and the placement of the doorways would be accurate to scale and placement, but we would only do doors. So the way that people knew that it was sort of like buildings really is there was like a door. And I also liked, I don't know, that was sort of like the most archetypal version of a building or something. So that was happening. And this is what it looked like. And the grid that it sat on was also mica. And then I think like, yeah, to the point of like this, like, how do I do this in a way that kind of like gives a historical reference point and also contextualizes what's happening in relation to like my politics and sort of like maybe like a reading of or a entry point into which we're sort of thinking about this stuff. I had started thinking a lot about Melanie K. Kandrowitz, who's a lesbian feminist, anti-Zionist writer and activist and thinker who was the first director of Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, which Mark knows well, which I was a teenage member of. And so I, sort of worked alongside her in that organization. And she was sort of the first person that I was around who was articulating a non-nationalist, anti-Zionist form of Jewish identity and doing it through many people that also Jenny Romaine and all these people that were involved both directly and indirectly in the community of Great Small Works and JFridge and overlapping with like ACT UP and Women WHAM and the other political groups at that time. She was sort of like doing this incredible work, also really drawing on largely unknown to the general public historical references like the Socialist Jewish Labor Bund, which had this idea of Doikite or here-ness that sort of called on Jews to make home where they were and fight side by side with the diverse residents of their communities as opposed to like a nation state, kind of idea. And so as this sort of other element in the room, I, along with Esther Kaplan, brilliant, many different things, writer, thinker, extremely close friend and collaborator of Melanie's, we put together this sort of like concept publication. We made one copy for the purpose of the presentation. We didn't put it into distribution, but that sort of mapped her history of writing and thinking and also involvement with anti-occupation work going back to 1989 when she first went to Gaza. We put together this publication that sort of, kind of went all over the place in her thinking and also her anti-racist work and stuff like that. This just to give you a point of reference, this is she proposed in 2003 at a conference this idea that Jews should return their right of return to Israel as a act of nonviolent direct action. And that was conceived of in relation to her experience as an anti-Vietnam War activist, seeing this action, Operation Dewey Canyon 3, in which Vietnam veterans returned their medals to the Capitol building. They threw their medals at the Capitol building. And that's where the kind of idea came from. So we showed, in the publication sort of historical reference points for all the stuff that she was talking about. This is, she wrote 2 pieces of writing after returning from Gaza in 1989. One was actually for, I believe it's the Rutland Herald. It was for a Vermont newspaper that you see on the left. And on the right was a graduation speech for the school she was teaching at that also spoke about her experience there. And then sort of finally in it kind of goes back to what the title is about, which I mentioned, which is this sort of idea of radical diasporism, which draws on that sort of Bundist idea of Doigkeit. And so Yivo graciously gave us, imagery from the Labor Bund, and then we presented this text alongside of it. Oops. And the model, the other thing I wanted to say, because I've already failed. Let's see. Let me do this again. Actually, I'm not going to pull the PowerPoint up again. But the thing I wanted to say about the model was like, for me, I think the model, my mother, because of her experience, I think was left her entire life, has been left her entire life with a sort of a fundamental feeling of vulnerability and instability because she doesn't remember anything that happened. And so there's always been like a hole there. And I think, this sort of idea of safety for her was something that she needed and carried through life in a very abstract way. And I think because, Israel was presented to her early on as like something that could offer that, she sort of took it. And I think increasingly sort of understood that was not real or the case, but at the same time couldn't release this sort of need for safety that ultimately had been for so long attached to this idea of like, a Jewish nation state. And I think going into this, like really, like as an anti-Zionist myself, like kind of, and having the, positive relationship I have with my mother and caring about her, I think there was a way in which, like, I remember there was a moment with sort of when I got to the point of being like, oh, I could make a model, I was like, oh, it's sort of like, what if I made my mother like the largest safety talisman of all time? Like what you were looking at is like a tenth of the city and was like, I don't know, 24 feet long or something. So it's like if you imagine the thing you saw times 10, like, I was like, what would it be like to like give her this safety talisman that's like the thing she doesn't remember, like the place and the moment. And I was like, I will trade you your need for safety embodied in Israel for an object that represents safety embodied in the form of this thing. And, it's not just that, and I don't want to explain it as that, but that definitely was like part of what I thought about in terms of why I was making the thing and what it could be for. Because it's also like impossible, it's like an impossible, going back to James Lee Byers or something, it's like an impossible object, which was really compelling to me. And I guess the other thing I should say, and then I'll shut up. 24 minutes is
You're good. You're
that,
good.
I think the thing that made the project possible, maybe going back to the beginning of what I said about it and it feeling like an impossible thing to do, was that it was a residency. And even though, it was open to the public, as it progressed, the building the model and whatever, it was like an exhibition in a way. I also was kind of like, actually, the bottom line is like, maybe it isn't possible. And all I can do is sort of make it like an inquiry and not a statement. Like, I don't think I ever would have done it as a show. It was more like, I'm going to just engage with all these things and be in it and let it not be an artwork because it isn't. It's just like things in a room. Like, where are we? What is this? And kind of let it be maybe a place where it's more about the attempt than it is about the outcome. And that was sort of like the position from which I did it. Yeah, that's hopefully that made sense in some way. I don't remember anything I said.
Wonderful. So great. I think this is being recorded, so I think you can,
Oh,
if you need to,
Jesus.
you need to check it out. We still see you. Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I mean, a research device, I would say, as well as, if not an artwork, but certainly a device allowing inquiry and perhaps some form of healing.
I was remembering when I took your class and we were talking about like it was like sympathetic magic.
Oh yeah.
Do you think that the model like was like acting in some form of like not a healing device, but like acting as another thing, like a form of like sympathetic magic?
Oh, now we don't hear you.
I've been gagged. Yeah, like that's so interesting. I mean, I love Michael Taussig so much, and the way that he puts things together. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm sympathetic magic. Yeah, I mean, what a great way to say it. I don't know what else to say. It's like so spot on, I think maybe one thing to say in relation to that is like, I think so often, maybe like art that's political in some way. There's this idea that like things have to be functionally political in a certain way that like makes I mean, I'll just say it because there's an audience and it's being recorded. I might as well have a position. I think like so much political art is so dry and like really not valuable or maybe offering anything as artwork, even if it is as activism very concretely. And similarly, I think so much artwork is not offering anything in the way of substantive content or like consideration of the world. And so or it's purely aesthetic. And so I think a lot of, when you say sympathetic magic or something, it's like, it's so interesting to me because I think that's it. I'm not saying I'm good at it, but I think something I aspire to is like, what happens if like you can do something that, is really meaningfully engaged in the work. Like Vaginal Davis, I think is a really great example of somebody who has the capacity to like really engage with culture and society in like a hyper political way, but do it through like a kind of aesthetic engagement or vehicle or sound piece that's way the fuck out there and like really challenging and like complete, like the simplest example would be like, she's a Black intersex person, and she had a Nazi punk band for a while. So that it's like a lot of people can't handle that, but it's like because it's like beyond functional. It's sort of like maybe I don't know. Somebody must have coined the term post-functional at this point, but it's like it is. So I think that's like a really. Yeah, I think like that's maybe like what I hope to see in the world, or like Reza Abdo, I think would be another great example of that, where it's like sort of in a place of unhinged vision and also rooted in ethics. And I think that combination is just hard. It's like it's hard to do and it's hard to receive, even though it's like I would argue that's the kind of stuff that shifts like an entire view. I don't know, but yeah, sympathetic magic, right on. That's like such a great thing.
Jonathan, thank you so much. I know the scheduling was tight today, and it's so great you could be with us. And we're going to move on to our next presenter, who I will stand up to announce. And we'll have some time for your thoughts and questions at the end, but I know it's going to be a little tight. Pablo Gershonik is joining us. Pablo is an actor, clown, director, and university lecturer. His work explores memory, trauma, and space through artistic creation and research. He's created the Intimate Maquettes Lab, which he'll speak to you about, an artistic and therapeutic device presented in museums, universities, and institutions in Canada, France, Argentina, Mexico, the UK, the US, and Belgium. He's taught and researched in Argentina, Mexico, Canada, and France, and he's a Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Scholar, pursuing a PhD here at Concordia in the Indie program. So I'm very excited to welcome Pablo. Has been at Fourth Space before, back in remote pandemic years, so I'm glad to have you back.
Thank you very much. You know what the thing is?
Can I sit here?
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much. Thanks. Hello, everyone. I'm very glad to be here, back home somehow. The Fourth Space is the first space where I came when I first came to Montreal, invited by a fantastic group of teachers here to talk about these intimate maquettes that I'm going to talk to you about. And for me, it's interesting because the first time I came as a practitioner, as an artist, and as a teacher to teach here. And by the fact of teaching and sharing with the community of Concordia what I was doing, I decided that it would be interesting also to come to the other side of the desk, to be a student. And so that's what I'm doing now. I'm studying here the Intimate Maquettes as an artistic device to go in terms of post-violence context and how to reconstruct through aesthetic approaches to post-violence events. And all this quest is based basically in three principles that I think inform my work as an artist and today as a researcher. The first one is that every personal story is at the same time a social story. The second one is that, as Hamlet said, something is rotten in the realm of Denmark. And the third one is that if we have a playground, if we can play, something about the invisible wounds we have can come to terms somehow. We can come to terms with that story. So what I'm going to present now is based on this project and how now it has like two different stages. The first one related to my artistic work and how through that I came to inventing somehow this other device that are the Intimate Maquettes. Oops. So, as I was saying, the Intimate Maquette started as an artistic quest, in my case, based on a couple of questions, which were, at the very moment your life changes forever, what's happening on your street, in your neighborhood, in your city, in your country, on the world's map. This is my city. What do you think about this city? Good, huh? This is the city of La Plata in Argentina. It's a perfect city. Why is it a perfect city? Yeah, it's been designed before being constructed. It's one of the three cities in Latin America that had this characteristic. The city of Brasilia, the city of Santa Cruz de la Sierra in Bolivia, and La Plata. So a French urbanist and an Argentinian politician decided that they had to create a capital city at the end of the 19th century to create a capital city for the region of Buenos Aires. There was the city of Buenos Aires and then the region of Buenos Aires. And this is the capital city for that region of Buenos Aires. So I was fascinated by this idea of a perfect city. In a time where in Argentina we could still think or dream of a utopic city, a perfect city. Argentina still could imagine as a country in that time with possibilities. Not really today, but that's another story. In 1975, the state terrorism hit my family. My father, who was a pediatrician and a political militant, was murdered by the fascist gangs of the Argentinian regime. That marked, as you can imagine, not just the story of this perfect city, but this perfect family. That was not that perfect. So, many years later, I decided to reconstruct somehow the story of this family and the story of this day, specifically this day. I wanted to go to April 10th, 1975, and I started wonder what was happening at that precise moment. And I was lucky enough to have an invitation coming from the Museum of Memory in Buenos Aires that used to be the most important concentration camp of the Americas during the 70s. You know that Argentina lived an abhorrent dictatorship from 76 until 83. And this became a museum. And they invited 8 artists to be there and to reply to the experience of a residency there through the construction of something, an artistic reply, an artistic device. So that's what I did. I decided that this perfect city was like a model, like a maquette. And I reconstructed the maquette my father's size, 184, size 184. And in this little city, in a scale city, to reconstruct everything I could in the idea of linking our personal story, our personal archives with public stories, public archives, and social and collective events happening at that specific moment. A city with a father's scale. So I started looking for what was happening at that specific time in Argentina and in the world in terms of what we could see, like the advertisements, the publicities, the graffitis, the fashion, and what we could listen to in terms of theater, in terms of radio, in terms of news, in terms of political discourses, in terms of the jukebox of that time. And I started creating like this universe. A universe that was informed by all these elements and that was visited by a little train, electric train, filming what was happening, that I was animating, that I was doing at that time, and projecting that in the walls of the concentration camp, the former concentration camp. The project was invited to a Saint-Quatre, to a Museum of Modern Art in Paris, and by being there, I realized something that was happening also in Buenos Aires when I started meeting people who were there saying, in this place, something happened to me, I survived the torture, I survived the fact of being disappeared in this concentration camp, or your father was my doctor, he brought me to the world, and this idea of every personal story is at the same time a social story. And when I was there in 2019, I started talking to the people who were saying, well, for us, the question of how, through arts, we can go and meet the invisible wound to try to reconstruct something is something that concerns us because we have lived the attacks. Charlie Hebdo, Bataclan, Nice, all the terrorist attacks. So this experience of residency, I decided to change it, not to create a show that I was supposed to do, but basically to create a laboratory where people coming from these stories could move together, could dance together, could recall together, could create these models, wondering if the way somehow creating a model had helped me to put the ghost of Hamlet's father outside myself and being capable of dialoguing with, could help others to create a playground to transform their own personal and social stories. And that's what I did. A lab. Whereas we were saying people coming from different situations, traumatic experiences, can work together, can dance together, can move together, and can finally perform not a new way of living the story, but telling the story, reconstructing how to tell and how to tell others the stories. So this project started, as I was saying, in France, dealing with the stories coming from these attacks, and also with artists coming from war or displacement experiences in Africa and in Latin America. And little by little, step by step, that became like a kind of matrix that I started like using to create conversation, public and intimate conversation in different contexts. First, as I was saying, in France, then going to Mexico, for instance, to work with people who had missed or lost beloved ones in terms of, well, the drug traffic violence or migration or different experiences. Of course, gender violence. This is a little fragment of a documentary that we did in Mexico with people having lived this experience of someone disappeared in their family. So I'm gonna share with you a little fragment based on these stories, Mexican stories, whenever you want. No. Yes.
Cerca del campo militar número 1, alguien es desaparecido en ese momento y en cada momento después de eso.
Mi papá va por nosotros a la escuela, como lo hacía regularmente. Llaman a la casa y le piden que acompañe a una señora.
Yo tomé la decisión de que sus cenizas las lleváramos al mar.
No leí pues estos gritos de auxilio.
Las paredes todavía estaban calientes.
¿Qué significa reconstruir una tragedia para una persona, para una familia, para una comunidad? Me pregunto si reconstruir tiene que ver con volver de alguna forma a la imagen inicial de una experiencia trágica o una experiencia traumática, o si reconstruir, por el contrario, tiene que ver más bien con reconstruirse. Solemos pensar que somos la muerte de nuestros seres queridos, que algo de nosotros se queda ahí. Y yo creo que sí, pero también creo que somos la vida de nuestros seres queridos.
Es una dimensión de creación que viene de historias de destrucción.
A través de la imaginación podemos transformar nuestros mundos tanto como queramos.
Not only bad news, we also use the intimate maquettes as a creative space to imagine projects. For instance, these environmental projects like forest gardens, this in this case was in France, a community that received a huge terrain, and they were wanting to create like an open space to talk about environmental issues and global warming, and to construct a space to shelter different species like trees, like fruit trees or fruit bushes, and to create a space of gathering, conversation, and also to produce a communitarian garden. So they didn't know how to place the trees and how to talk about their relationship with nature. So we created this lab to help kids and to help the community to decide how to place the space. The labs have been happening since 2019, and the last one was last week. And when Mark had this good idea of talking about somehow the last process that we did, I decided to share some elements and some images about this lab that we did last week at the MIAM, la Maison Internationale des Arts de la Marionnette, with 8 brilliant Amazonas and puppeteers. And one of them is here today. So Marie-Claude Morin, I will invite her to show a little bit the result of the maquette that she did that is just incredible. So just to say that, as I was saying, 3 aspects are basically engaged in these laboratories. Object theater, so people work on object theater to start understanding this idea of self-distancing somehow, and also to create metaphors, How can we say and how can we create these stories beyond words with metaphors, with images? Then they move together, we move together. So we work a lot on constructing based on memories, like choreographic sentences or moments that they will use later perhaps to present or to embody the models. There is a part of bricolage, which is they create these three-dimensional audiovisual and narrative devices. And then an important part is the presentation. I think that is very, very important to have this conversation with the audience. And that is where we assume that bringing to the public conversation some stories that many times are put aside from the table of the public conversation is very, very important. And that's when an intimate space becomes public, becomes collective, becomes social. So I would like to invite Marie-Claude to come to show a little bit. I don't know if it's possible for you to see, but what we are going to present now is not a performance, it's just some tableaux, some images that came out this last week. So I don't know if you can see there, otherwise you can come and join us, but as you please. Oh. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. So this, as I was saying, are just some pictures, some tableaux from what we did, but later open to conversation and to whatever you want to exchange with us. Thank you very, very much.
So thank you, Pablo and Marie-Claude. Thank you for coming today. It's so great you brought your model from your workshop. We have one final offering, a performance by Caitlin Ross, who's right here. Yes, Caitlin is a multidisciplinary artist working as a puppeteer and theater designer in Jojage, Montreal. Since 2018, she's been performing with the Bread and Puppet Theater, touring various shows in the US and Canada. In 2021, she co-founded Corrugated Spectacles with Denise Rogers Valenzuela. Their show, Variety Box, a toy theater circus, has been performed at Objecto, the OOF, Castellier, Phenomena, and the Cabot Arts and Music Festival in Vermont. She also has facilitated workshops in puppetry, puppet building, object theater, and cantastoria. Her work centers around forms of visual narratives using puppetry and theater as a medium to shed light on political discourse. And Caitlin is a BFA graduate of our theater design program here at Concordia, and has worked as a costume designer and art director on various shows here in Montreal. So welcome, Caitlin, our final offering. Hopefully we'll have a few minutes, maybe we'll go a few minutes beyond 5 o'clock if that's okay with our hosts, and thank you again.
Turn off the light in every room. Sit in the inner hallway of the house, away from the windows. Stay away from the stove. Stop thinking about making black tea. Have a bottle of water nearby, big enough to cool down children's fears. Get a child's kindergarten backpack and stuff, tiny toys, and whatever amount of money there is. And the ID cards. And the photos of the late grandparents, aunts, or uncles. And the grandparents' wedding invitation that's been kept for a long time. And if you are a farmer, you should have strawberry seeds in one pocket. and soil from the balcony flower pot in the other. And hold on tight to whatever number there was on the cake from the last birthday. Thank you.
Thanks, Caitlin. Thanks to all our presenters today. We have miraculously a few minutes, and you've been sitting here very patiently, absorbing a lot, I have a feeling. So maybe we can take a minute and just have a little bit of a response or questions or thoughts from you all. I don't know if there are folks on Zoom. Maybe the presenters can come up and we can, as is customary, sit in front for a minute. And I don't know if Jonathan, are you still with us, or if there are questions from the Zoom world?
Yeah, if there's any questions in the chat, just
we'd be happy.
pop them in there. We can read them out.
Amazing, amazing. Where to begin? Yes, you have a question, yeah.
Let me just bring a mic over.
I'm thinking about a friend of mine in New York who is a social worker and who worked for years with troubled children. And she had a theater of the small in a sandbox with little figures. And she had the children playing with mommy and daddy, interacting, so that she could find out what the trauma was and how it manifested. So there's an application of the theater of the small in the real world. And for Jonathan, I was thinking about your mother and how you were offering her what you conceived of as safety through this project. But I also noticed that these are glass houses. So I'm curious about the mica and how you ended up with the idea of transparency there. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, maybe like a simple way to say it is it's like, which goes into the model thing is like, it's sort of like it's like the idea, it's like a model of something. So it's less like this, and they're not glass, they're mica. So it's sort of, I totally understand what you mean, that they're see-through and stuff like that. But yeah, I think maybe, I don't know what I can say about the choice to make it in that way is, which goes back to the content, is I think, the reason that I have like hesitation around the miniature or don't always use it or really try to find a way to engage with it that sort of is, maybe like I hope unpredictable or sort of at odds with the expectations people have about it aesthetically, is that I think there is like a very strong set of aesthetics and emotions that are attached to seeing small things in the context of like art of any kind. And I think a lot of the time that's like, there's a way in which very quickly that can go into like nostalgia or passivity or, twee or these things that for me personally as a creative person, I'm not interested in. And I also think get kind of problematic in the making of something in terms of the kind of engagement I want people to have. And I think in that case, in the case of that project, the mica was sort of more, it was like a phenomenologic, it like had the capacity to do something as a material and look a certain way that felt very at odds with certainly like the sort of war stuff. Like it was like, I remember saying to somebody like, oh, which I got really excited about, to be honest. I was like, oh, it's like Disco Narnia, like meets World War II. Like that's not like that's fucked up. Like this was sort of like, I like that there's a friction there, maybe is the best way to say it. And, I don't know if it worked, but it's like, it wouldn't have worked to use like something that aligned with maybe the kinds of feelings or aesthetics or, old or whatever. And at the same time, I was very careful, like, to have another layer of friction where like we made everything by hand as perfectly as we could. So it's not like made by a machine or fabricated by somebody else or whatever. Those are the sorts of things that I guess when you ask about the sort of material nature of it, that was the stuff that I thought a lot about. Was kind of how to push against like maybe some of the content, but also against like, the sort of maybe expectations people have of small things in the context of art, and like Byers, I think was always very good at that. It's a bit of an answer, but.
I was just thinking about how when you were introducing us to Byers' work, you talked about the kind of a sort of dialectic of the miniature and the monumental. And that seems like that's coming up in so many of the projects and the ideas and the work we're looking at in this afternoon is that sort of as you push on the miniature a little bit, you sort of somehow end up in some monumental realm, if it's conceptual or otherwise, or if it's sort of implied in these small scale worlds. And I'm also thinking the word that just has been in my head since, Antonia, since your presentation is constraints, the research device as giving us constraints to work with. And that also seems like a nice through line across these projects, as everybody's kind of, struggling with these self-imposed constraints of smallness or the edge of the table or the shape of the box or whatever the research device imposes is suddenly becomes the thing you struggle with. And then it's the process of struggling with that, as also, as you said, Jonathan, about the piece not ending, the MoMA piece not ending as a finished artwork, but as almost like a chapter of an ongoing process that's still going, right? The lease on the apartment, or I don't know, I assume it's unfinished, or it's happening now as we were talking about it. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions?
Oh, yes.
Great.
Thank you. I've got a question for the whole panel. I'll give an illustration of what I'm talking about quickly, and then I'll ask the question. One of my favorite examples of small art by an anonymous artist I found on the Millennium Bridge in London, which is the bridge you take to cross the river from the Tate Museum. On this bridge, tens of thousands of feet every day have pressed pieces of gum into small little canvases about 1 centimeter across. And on these canvases, someone has painted tiny little portraits of various peoples moving around, which you can only spot by accident and by getting on your hands and knees to examine. Question, that's in a public space, something discovered accidentally. I love spaces like this. They are and will be easily eliminated, I think, as we move into the coming years. How can miniature art enter into the public space, get out of these spaces and be seen by the public, and what advantages may miniature art have in this respect as kind of a small thing surviving like cockroaches amidst an unhospitable world?
Want to engage with that?
You want to go? I have no idea.
Sorry, were you?
But I think that that is the fact of creating tiny spaces, tiny conversations, tiny communities that will allow us to face the years to come. I come from a tradition that used to think that you need to change the world to change the individual. Perhaps I'm imagining could be the other way as well. So I tend to think that resistance has to do with a tiny elementary structures, that miniature structures, like in artistic creations or social little conversations, to then perhaps start like moving somewhere else in conversations.
Mm-hmm.
That's my hypothesis on miniatures and social spaces.
And I think we have seen a kind of like a common thread of like what happened with things on small scale that is probably similar to what you're describing, in terms of like there's something that you're not prepared to, and it's true, as Jonathan is saying, that can easily become something cute, and we have like a very clear repertoire to think about the cute and in a way dismiss that, but there's like a very interesting affective quality of like seeing things in another scale that, yeah, create like this kind of like a small poetic gap or gesture where other type of conversations can happen, right? Is that what you were like doing with the workshops, or?
I think so. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think the miniature also refers to the little temporary social grouping of the group working on the project, or like I think in the intimate maquette workshops too, there's this little sociality that's very temporary and small, but kind of effective and intense, that comes around the working with in our case, with the cardboard box or the small proscenium or the tabletop, you know, if it's 36 inches square, whatever it is that you have to work with, there's this kind of investment in that little space that somehow translates to an effective experience. Or maybe your team cutting mica walls and cutting the doors in them, you know, it's interesting to think about what the side effects are of the labor, you know, of that, doing that work, what that does to you is quite interesting.
Which is always excessive with the miniature, right? There's like clearly it excesses the miniature itself, because like there is no correspondence and the scale of the thing and the amount of labor that you have spent on the thing, right?
I think there's like also maybe in relation to the specific question, like, I'm just gonna like, because we looked at it, like I think another interesting example of like a buyer's thing was he printed like thousands of these little teeny gold, they were like half an inch, 3/4 of an inch pieces of gold confetti, paper confetti, and he printed little phrases like was on the ball or whatever, so small that you really did need a magnifying glass. And he had people give them out or throw them like in the street. And I remember interviewing his widow, and she was like, yeah, James Lee believed that anybody who took the time and had the curiosity to pick the thing up or look should have an artwork. And I think like the thing about like the small, like you described it on the bridge or whatever in public is I think there's a way in which, you know, the monumental, for example, it's like telling you it's there. And, you know, the miniature, there's a way in which it like makes people have a kind of like agency and activity where like they're going into something. And I think that's like when you ask about like in the context of, you know, outside or whatever, I think like that's just a very different kind of viewing. That's like active engagement versus like passive reception or something. It's like a different thing. And it's like a lot more, you know, maybe humanist, or which I know is a problematic word, but like, you know, like human in its sort of like the person is choosing to participate in something, and there's a very different relationship. And because there's that relationship, what the thing means to the person is very different. Like, you know, at the same time, like, you know, the Byers thing, it's like, I think all the time about like, he did that in, I don't know, the 90s or something. And it's like the people in the world that like still picked up one of those pieces of paper and are living with it, you know, and the way that it changed their life and the relationship they have to the way that that object came into their life and the way they found it. That's like a very, you know, that's like a very unusual, special thing that doesn't happen with like art in terms of how people encounter it or receive it. It's like very, extremely specific, and I think like really kind of like, I don't know, like profound actually in a way, like in terms of the capacity of what a miniature thing in outside can do.
We're just past 5 o'clock. I bet we have time for one more question or thought, maybe from the Zoom chat, if anyone's intervening there or anyone else in the room, but I think we're reaching the end of our time. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? I'm coming with a microphone. Hang on, just so that your online panelists.
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting stuff, so thank you for all the presentations. My question picks up a little bit from the last, which is about the sort of problem of attention. And you know, watching you all, Antonia, in the video you show, in the work that was just performed, it requires a certain kind of attention, and we lean in. The miniature asks us to sort of be with it in a different way that I think is incredibly powerful. So it's not just the compression of labor and your attention, but the way, the demands it makes on the viewer. So I'm curious just to hear your thoughts on, you know, what that, like that attention is so special right now, particularly in the attention economy, and, you know, with our cell phones peeping and et cetera. I'd love to hear anybody's thoughts on how you're sort of navigating the battle for attention, or how you think about it in terms of your practices. Thank you.
I'm going to start, but I'm not gonna monopolize this. In the case of the performance that I showed, it was the question of attention is very funny, because I was one of thousands or hundreds of other camps, and the rest of the camps were very explicitly sexual, and I still had like a bit of an audience, because this was completely unexpected. So people were like drawn to that, and some people stay and like start like asking questions, and at some point the conversation became kind of normal or standard, and and then there was like, I was trying to continue performing, but people were like just like chatting about their daily life. So it was a very interesting exercise of attention, because yes, this was like, it was attractive, but obviously not as attractive as like as an explicit sexual performance happening in the channel, like at the side. So, yeah, well, I'm not answering the question, but it's a beautiful interrogation. Yeah.
I think that the scale being intimate, but also sometimes the materials, like my show's paper, a lot of great small works is cardboard. I think there's something in both of those things that kind of bringing something small, and it's meant to be played for like a small audience, which I think is also different. Like I've played it for like 15 people, I've played it for one person, I've played it for 50, and I was like, that's too much, it doesn't work. This is my first time of it being live fed. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think it also brings something childlike that's really different in our attention, I think, to the material, the scale, and then the fact that we have all these other associations with play in a small scale. Yeah, make it really unique and fragile, intimate, personal, tangible. Yeah, in a way that's really different than like a big scale production on a human-sized stage.
Yeah, what for me is interesting is that by reducing the scale, you also make another scale bigger, which is the dimension of the audience somehow. And that for me is interesting because we tend to, and in these times even more, we tend to be just focused on one single spot, one single thing. Our attention is placed on one single space. And if you have a traumatic event, even more. So what I think is interesting of this idea of a dimension that you can face 360 degrees, or you can have like the big picture, is that you can construct some other parts and you can complete a perspective that normally when you just see that specific spot, you cannot. And that you realize that you cannot face the 360 on your own, that you need someone in front to complete the image. And that for me is also basic.
If there isn't a final question or intervention, maybe we'll leave it there. Thank you all so much for coming. You've been a very, felt a very giving audience tonight. And Caitlin and Pablo, Antonia, Jonathan, thank you so much. And again, thanks to our hosts here, Fourth Space. And and thanks for all of you on Zoom who are reacting.
Clapping and being hard.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks everyone for coming in. Thanks for the questions also. We're going to close up the Zoom and the live stream now. Just a reminder that this remains available on our YouTube channel and you should revisit it. You should share it and you should have a wonderful evening. Thanks for joining us.